Ford Airport, dedicated in January 1925, was considered one of the finest in the country at the time. The following views represent various phases of the airport between 1925 and 1932. In the foreground is the dirigible mooring mast erected in the summer of 1925. The letters in the Ford name along the runway were spelled out in white crushed stone 200 feet high to help pilots determine their location. Moving right to left, you see the first small hangar built in 1924, and the new larger hangar and the first assembly line building, both built in 1926. In 1929, Ford Airport became the first in the world to provide concrete runways, made possible by brakes and tail wheels on airplanes, both of which were patented by Ford engineers. At the extreme left is the Dearborn Inn, built to accommodate air passengers. At the top of the field, you can see the Henry Ford Museum in Greenfield Village. In the foreground is the Ford Airplane Factory with its twin assembly line buildings in late 1929. Bill Stout was the first in the United States to build an all-metal airplane. His first commercial all-metal plane was the 2AT seen here and was named the Made in Detroit. That is, made in Detroit, the location of his factory. The second plane was made in the new Ford factory in Dearborn and was, of course, named the Made in Dearborn. The first plane was sold to the U.S. Post Office, with the next 5 being used by Ford's Air Transport Service, started in April 1925 to carry Ford freight between their facilities in Dearborn and Chicago. Ford's Air Service was announced as an experiment to demonstrate the safety and reliability of commercial aviation to the public at large. Not many modern conveniences. You started them just like the old Model T cars, hand-cranked. They were open cockpit planes typical of the period, powered by a surplus World War I 400 horsepower Liberty engine, originally built by Ford in 1918. There were a total of 11 of these planes produced by the time production ended in December 1925. This is a public relations film produced by Ford to convince the public of the safety and reliability of commercial aviation. Ford's first scheduled air service was started in April 1925 between Dearborn and Chicago. In July, the Dearborn to Cleveland route was inaugurated, and a Dearborn to Buffalo route was added later. For the first time, planes adhered to a strict time schedule, as Henry Ford would have it no other way. By August 1925, Stout had sold his Stout All-Metal Airplane Company to Henry Ford, as he realized it would require the organization and funds that only Ford could provide to make it successful. Henry Ford now had an airport, an airplane manufacturing plant, as well as a scheduled air freight service, giving commercial aviation a tremendous shot in the arm. The value of the Ford name in the eyes of the public should not be underestimated. The prevailing attitude was that Henry Ford was a financial genius, and because he made the automobile affordable to nearly everyone, he was a friend of the average person. If Ford was involved in it, it must be okay. All operational information gained in operating the airport, the air freight service, and the airplane manufacturing was freely and willingly shared with others. In fact, Ford did not charge for the use of the many aviation patents his engineers were granted, including the most important, the radio beacon that allowed planes to fly in most types of weather. In addition, Ford spent nearly $4 million during this period to promote aviation and the Ford plane. Ford pilot William DeWald, returning from the Chicago run, is greeted by Henry Ford. While Henry Ford was very interested in his aviation project, he gave most of the credit for its success to his son Edsel. Ford pilot Leroy Manning gets ready for his flight to Cleveland. Manning would become the airport manager in November 1928 and die in the crash of an experimental Ford trimotor bomber in September 1931. In the 7 years of operation, there were only 5 fatal crashes claiming 8 lives, 2 crashes in operating the air transport service, and 3 in testing the new Ford planes. Henry Ford and Clara Ford and their guests watched the departure of the Cleveland-bound plane. The crowds at the Cleveland airport are indicative of the public's interest in both aviation and Henry Ford's new venture. As these planes had no brakes, local people had to rush out to slow the plane down and help steer it to a stop. With the lack of safety regulations apparent in most of these films, you can understand why there were many accidents at airports in the early years. Never one to pass up the opportunity to attract attention, Ford used these highly polished, shiny trucks to carry company freight and mail between his plants and the airport. When the federal government started licensing pilots and airplanes in 1928, this plane was declared unairworthy, in spite of the fact that one had flown over 132,000 miles, and collectively the two ATs had just one weather-related fatality. Henry Ford terminated his air transport service in August 1932, declaring there was now sufficient commercial service available to handle his needs. During that 7.5 years, Ford pilots completed 98% of the 9,700 flights attempted. They flew for over 20,000 hours, covering nearly 2 million miles, and carried almost 13 million pounds of freight with only 2 fatal accidents. Quite a record for those years. This model of a 3-motor plane represented the fact that Ford realized the need for larger, more powerful planes, and it developed into the 3AT model designed by Bill Stout. One of the single-engine Stout planes was modified by lengthening the wing, installing 3 of the new 200-horsepower Wright engines, and strengthening the fuselage and landing gear. The first flight of the 3AT in November 1925. It proved to be as aerodynamically unsound as it was ugly, and Ford's chief test pilot refused to fly it anymore. Following the disastrous flight of the 3AT, Henry Ford was quoted as saying, "For the first time in my life I've bought a lemon, and I don't want the world to know about it." This is the factory Ford had built for Bill Stout's Metal Airplane Company in late 1924. And this is the factory in January 1926 with the ugly 3AT still inside. Just 6 weeks after Henry Ford's comments about a lemon, the building burned down, conveniently destroying the 3AT and eliminating Ford's failure. This didn't deter Ford's interest in aviation, as he immediately started a new, much larger airplane factory and hangar. Here is the first small hangar with the Ford Airport sign on top. The new larger hangar, which was considered the largest and most modern in the world, with spaces for 15 planes, the doors on either side slid into the ends of the building. Next is the new airplane factory, as it was before the second section was added in late 1929. Next is the terminal building to handle Ford's air transport service for company freight, and Bill Stout's new Stout Airline, dedicated to sightseeing and passenger service between Dearborn and Grand Rapids, and later Cleveland and Chicago. The two air services were independent of each other. Ford ran his freight operation, and Stout ran his passenger service. All Ford airplane buildings, as well as most of Ford's other automotive facilities, were designed by the noted architect Albert Kahn. Additional luggage and mail storage was provided by external wing bins installed in most of the commercial airline trimotors. The Dearborn Inn, one of the first hotels built to handle air passengers, was opened in 1931 and is still owned by Ford Motor Company. In April 1926, Ford announced he would henceforth build only 3-engine airplanes. This was for safety, reliability, and capacity. It was a remarkable decision, as the only other 3-engine plane being built was the new Fokker, made of wood and fabric. These scenes are of the first flight of the Ford-designed trimotor in June 1926. It was a complete success and was obviously a real thrill for Henry and Edsel Ford, considering the disaster of the 3AT only 6 months before. Ford's little flivver plane was also developed and flight tested about the same time. The first 3 trimotors were built with open cockpits and tail skids, but were later rebuilt to enclose the cockpit and add the tail wheel and brakes. They all had the inertia starter for the engines in place of the hand cranking shown earlier. Bill Mayo, chief engineer of Ford Motor Company, was largely responsible for the success of Ford's airplane venture. He was an officer of several aviation organizations and a member of the board of directors for many of the newly created aviation companies and airlines. The all-metal, three-engine plane backed by the Ford name revolutionized the public's conception of safety in air travel. Ford airplanes dominated the commercial aviation industry until Ford abandoned airplane production in 1932 and relinquished the business to the new Douglas DC-3. The most famous of the trimotors was the plane used by Admiral Byrd on his historic flight over the South Pole in 1929. This plane is preserved in the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan. Ford planes were built with wheels, pontoons, and skis. This seaplane is undergoing tests on the Rouge River by the huge Ford assembly plant. This 1931 view of 5AT-100, one of the last trimotors built, reflects the many modifications and streamlining over the first Ford trimotor that took to the air in 1926. The corrugated light duralumin metal skin, an alloy of 94% aluminum and 4% copper, came in plain sheets that were heat treated and then corrugated just prior to use, giving it the strength of steel. Wing sections were assembled vertically to save space. The wings were nearly 3 feet thick, giving the plane enormous lift for a quick takeoff, ideal for operations on the small early airfields. Ford was the first airplane manufacturer to set up a car-like production line for airplanes and reached a high point in June 1929 with 25 planes produced. A total of 197 Ford trimotor planes were built before production ceased in 1932. Ford's decision to quit aviation was influenced by a number of things. First, there were fewer and fewer buyers for large commercial planes. He was advised that he could build enough planes in 6 months to provide all the commercial airplanes that would be needed by the U.S. industry for the next 4 years. Second, with the onset of the Depression, Ford had seen his automobile sales decline from nearly 2 million vehicles in 1929 to less than 400,000 vehicles in 1932. He had to get back to his core business. There are currently 5 Ford trimotors in flying condition, 4 others fully restored in museums, and 3 or more in the process of restoration. Henry Ford realized very early that larger planes would be needed to make commercial aviation pay, and by June 1930 had his designers working on this airplane, designated 14AT. Designed to carry 32 passengers in luxury, it cost Ford over $1 million, about 10% of his total aviation expenditures. While it never flew, they learned a lot about engineering large aircraft, and it marked Ford's final effort in commercial aviation. While most of the public's attention was centered on the trimotor, Ford also dabbled in making small personal planes, dubbed by some flivvers of the air. The first aerial flivver was introduced to the public in July 1926. It was powered by a 3-cylinder, 35-horsepower French Anzani engine and flown only by Ford's chief test pilot Harry Brooks and once by Charles Lindbergh. Harry Brooks was the favorite pilot of Henry Ford and used the little plane as one would use a company car, commuting from Ford Airport to his home in Birmingham, Michigan. He was a contemporary of Charles Lindbergh, and because of people's interest in aviation, gained a great deal of notice by the local press. This plane now hangs in the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan. In September 1927, a new larger flivver with a 2-cylinder, 29-horsepower Ford engine was built, to break the light plane long-distance record. In February 1928, Brooks took off from Ford Airport heading for Miami, Florida. Running out of gas, he was forced down in Titusville, Florida, cracking his propeller and landing. But he had set a new world's record. 4 days later, Brooks took off from Miami and crashed in the Atlantic Ocean. The wreckage of the plane was recovered, but Brooks' body was never found, nor was the cause of the accident ever determined. This Ford twin-engine amphibian designed by Stout never flew. While this Stout-designed Ford 5-passenger plane did fly, it did not fly well. The last Ford plane was this 2-seat flying wing built in 1936. Powered by a Ford V8 aluminum engine, it proved difficult to control and it quietly disappeared. In August 1927, Charles Lindbergh visited Ford Airport on tour of the United States, following his historic solo flight over the Atlantic Ocean to Paris. It was during this visit that Lindbergh took Henry Ford and then Edsel Ford for their first airplane rides in his Spirit of St. Louis airplane. This visit would lead to a lifelong friendship between Henry Ford and Lindbergh and resulted in Ford hiring Lindbergh in 1941 as an advisor to help build B-24 bombers at Ford's massive Willow Run plant during World War II. There were many celebrities in attendance, including Eddie Rickenbacker, America's top World War I ace, seen here on the right. Just prior to departure, Bill Mayo, Bill Stout, and Henry and Edsel Ford say goodbye to Lindbergh. One of Ford's top flight mechanics, Carl Wenzel in the white coveralls, would be another of the casualties of Ford aviation, dying in a crash of the Ford Trimotor in November 1930. In 1925, believing in the future of the lighter-than-air ships and hoping to entice the Navy dirigibles to Dearborn, Ford built the only privately owned mooring mast in the world. The Army's semi-rigid airship RS-1 was the first to hook up in October 1926. Nearly 300 feet long with a displacement of over 750,000 cubic feet, it was a relatively small airship. A month later, in November 1926, the Navy's rigid airship Los Angeles docked. It was a much larger ship, at 650 feet in length, and with a displacement of 2.5 million cubic feet. These would be the only 2 times the mast would be used, as numerous deficiencies were noted by the Navy. Exit was through this door in the nose of the airship, and then an elevator ride down the mooring mast to ground level. A unique rotating haul-down device had been installed in the tower to allow entry of the airship at ground level. However, it never operated properly and was one of the deficiencies noted by the Navy. decision to build the mooring mast was generated by a visit to Ford Airport in October 1924 by Dr. Hugo Echner, the foremost commander of the German Zeppelin airships. Henry Ford invited him to bring his airship with him on his next visit to Michigan. Dr. Echner replied he would like to, but Ford had no mooring mast. Henry Ford replied, "That's easy. I'll build one." Ford men spent the month of June 1925 working 24 hours a day to finish the mast in time for the planned visit of the Navy's airship Shenandoah on July 4th. The trip was delayed until September, and unfortunately the big airship was destroyed in a storm over southeast Ohio the day before it was scheduled to tie up at the Ford mast. These are banks of helium tanks for refilling the gas bags in the Los Angeles. During the visit of the Los Angeles, Harry Brooks buzzed the airship in the little Ford Flivver. It is amazing the Navy would let any aircraft that near their pride and joy. The toppling of the mooring mast in October 1946 represented the end of an era at Ford and the end of a landmark for Dearborn. Cables were attached to 4 heavy-duty trucks, and on command they proceeded to pull the 210-foot tower over. Henry Ford and his wife Clara watched the tower come down in what was one of his last public appearances, as he died in April 1947. Ford Airport had been active during World War II and was serving as the base for Ford's new air transportation office for company planes. It closed in 1947, becoming the Dearborn Test Track and ending Ford's involvement in commercial aviation.